Welcome to this Early Years in Mind webinar, which is about thinking differently about speech, language, and communication in the early years. I'll go over some housekeeping. Closed captions will be available during the webinar. Please click on the closed captions button to enable these at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled during the webinar. If you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function. There is also the opportunity to speak to members of the team as well if you're having any technical difficulties via the Q&A. This webinar will be recorded and available via Anna Freud's YouTube channel after the session. We have BSL interpreters with us for the duration of the webinar. To make sure they're visible on your screen, please use the option Follow the Host View, which you can find in the top right-hand side of your screen. For those of you who are new to the Early Years in Mind network, this has been set up to support early years practitioners to think about the mental health and well-being of children in the early years. Supporting the mental health of the next generation is our key mission at Anna Freud. Speech, language, and communication skills are of intrinsic importance to mental health. I'll outline 3 reasons why. We need to be able to communicate with others to form relationships. As well as the words we use, communication is built on our earliest relationships with our caregivers, where the infant's needs are recognized and responded to. Those serve and return interactions where the infant learns that their emotional needs and physical needs matter, and that interacting with others is a safe and enjoyable experience. Sadly, we know that not all children receive this positive experience early on in their lives. Working as an educational and child psychologist, part of my role was to support children who were excluded from school. I also worked with young offenders and focused my thesis on supporting young offenders. Many of these children were known to social care at some point in their lives. These children would fall under the social, emotional, and mental health category of the Special Needs Code of Practice because their behaviour was most apparent and obvious concern. Working with these children on an individual basis, it became clear that many of them who had been excluded were children with speech, language, and communication needs. Unfortunately, the majority of them had never received support from professionals like speech and language therapy or educational psychology, and nor would they go on to receive the level of support they needed. When children in the early years are developing their communication systems, we are also thinking about pre-verbal children here, and those who use augmentative and alternative communication aids. When they struggle to understand and be understood, we've all seen those children become emotionally dysregulated. Practitioners working in the early years will be aware of increasing numbers of children who require support with communication and language. And this is a message that has been reinforced since the COVID pandemic. So it is a pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers who will introduce themselves and say a bit about the work that they do. And then we will follow up with a panel discussion. And then you will have the opportunity to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions in our Q&A. Okay, and now I'd like to hand over to our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Abby, for putting this much needed webinar together. And thank you everybody for attending and coming. I'm really excited to speak to you all about some of the work that I'm doing. I think it's really important that I pretext this by explaining that my work is not separate from my own lived experience. The work I do or that we do does not exist in a vacuum. We live in a world with a history, and often that history is marred by inequalities, injustice, and all forms of isms. I hark back and think about the work of Bernard Coard in the 1970s, when he looked at how the West Indian child is made educationally subnormal. And I base a lot of my thinking from that piece of work. I think it's really important, as much as a bio is great for you to know who I am, I always believe that positionality statements are very powerful and needed when we're doing work, and especially this type of work. So I'll start off with my positionality statement. So I'm a Black neurodivergent woman of East African heritage. My paternal roots are from Ethiopia and my maternal roots are from Somalia. I was initially raised in South London as a young child in a predominantly working class urban environment. Despite my parents' extensive educational background in East Africa, they arrived in London fleeing a civil war and were asylum seekers who took jobs in the hospitality industry before studying and retraining in a professional capacity. So this resulted in my family moving when their finances improved, and it resulted in me spending my teenage years in a more affluent part of South London. I spent much of my childhood in between the margins, not fully belonging in either locations or spaces I inhabited. My educational experiences range from being labeled gifted and talented by my school to also being expelled from my classes and being told throughout my educational experience that my writing, my thinking, my speaking missed the mark, needed correcting and fixing. As a multilingual speech and language therapist and educator, I am keen to interrogate the impact of anti-Blackness on the people I work with and the practitioners. And so I am a speech and language therapist, and I started my career off working in what I would say was a traditional sense. But as I have developed and grown and thought about my own intersectional identity, the identities of the children that I work with, and found that the approaches that I was using or was used to using or I was told were the correct ways to do things often did not work for those most marginalized, those Black and brown children, right? Marginalized by the system in many ways. So I started shifting my paradigm. And when I shifted my paradigm, my practice changed along with it. I want to really be clear and say, I don't have any answers or a toolkit that I can give you on ways to do this work. But what I do have is a will and an ability to test, experience, and try new ways of working. This has led me, so this work that I've done has led me to creating an approach in which I call spaces of reprieve, which I won't discuss completely in detail what it entails, but I want to just show you the formulation of how it happened. So my work interrogates the foundations of the speech and language therapy profession, which is rooted in biopolitical, colonial, and racist ideologies. Speech language therapy practices create dichotomous categories of norm and disorder by routinely applying standard language ideologies designed by white middle-class literate men. These ideologies are exclusionary in that they privilege children who are deemed to produce standard patterns and pathologize minoritized Black and brown children without any cognitive or linguistic impairments. The perceived embodied difference between minoritized and white children in their race and languaging results in the construction of normalcy and the creation of the pathologized/disordered subjects. Often we use remedial programs which are developed within this context, and speech or any form of correction is applied as a legitimate scientific technique to approximate Black and brown bodies to the ideal status of white norms in language and communication. What I found in my years of practice is that there were not any approaches that truly allowed for the freedom to subvert from practicing in ways that dehumanize, pathologize, stigmatize, and denigrate the language of Black and brown children. As a result, I began to explore the ways the profession could design spaces centered on birthing possibilities of healing, creativity, and linguistic liberation. So this resulted in the creation of an emancipatory practice, which I termed spaces of reprieve and collaboration. And so spaces of reprieve allow children time and space to be away from the hostile school environments that impose standardized language ideologies onto them. whilst also creating opportunities of therapeutic healing and meaning making to excavate the deep impacts these ideologies have had on them. I would argue that these spaces act as a critical tool towards rejecting abysmal thinking that focuses on colonial and fossilized ideologies about language to one that recognize hybridity and the variability in communication. And I believe by expanding the scope of spaces of reprieve as an embodied practice that connects the lived experience of minoritized children and therapeutic approaches to one that has the potential to support and build citizenship that addresses the harms of racist and colonial ideologies. And so that might be a mouthful and very complex to understand, but what I'm saying is really simple. I'm saying that in our society, there are many children who are marginalized for how they speak, for how they communicate. There are children in our education system right now that are having a tough time. And I hark it back to my own lived experience as a minoritized Black child who was told her languaging was not good enough. And I reflect on this when I worked with children in inner London and saw that they were having the same experiences as me. And so my hope and the work that I do, as I said before, is about shifting these paradigms and changing the way that we view language, the way that we view minoritized children, and the way that we view the speech and language therapy profession. I really hope that the conversation started here and the work that is already happening with things such as the neurodiversity affirming approaches are only going to continue to grow as we start to move away from this deficit-based lens and look at children's inherent abilities with languaging. So I'm just going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wada, for your input. I'd like to hand over now to our next speaker, Kerry Murphy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon, and thank you for those of you who have come along to think about speech, language, and communication differently. So today I'm going to be speaking about Gestalt language processing and delayed echolalia. And this might be something that you've heard of before. It's certainly a really exciting pathway for language development that a lot of early educators are becoming salient to. And today I just want to talk to you about the importance of this and the implications of us actually broadening our understanding of developmental diversity and why it is so needed. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction to me. If we just switch the slides twice. So let me just move my chat out the way. So who am I? So my name is Kerry Murphy and I'm an early childhood specialist. I have worked in early childhood now for about 18 years. It's one of my biggest passions in the work that I do. And I very intentionally chose to focus my work with children between the ages of 0 and 4. The early childhood sector itself is very marginalised and often looked down upon. And I think it's an area where we often overlook the rich sources of knowledge. So I've really intentionally stayed within that developmental phase, because we are often at the beginning stages of the development pathway and including those children who are going to diverge from what is typically expected and some of those developmental norms that we see upheld within our early childhood sector. I myself am also neurodivergent. I am autistic and ADHD, and I often will draw upon my own lived experiences to inform the work that I do. I'm also a lecturer at Goldsmiths University, and I work on the undergrad, postgrad and PGC programmes. And what's really interesting about working on a PGC programme is because my background is in early childhood, it's interesting to see that transition from what happens in the early years phase and how we move into some of those more conformity-based practices and the harms that that can cause for our neurodivergent and disabled children. I'm also an author, writer and trainer. I get a lot of my professional oxygen from being with early years practitioners essentially, and really looking at a lot of the thinking outside of the box that happens within our phase, our educational phase. I am also doing my doctorate. As you can see there, I'm in that messy existential crisis phase where I'm wondering what the hell I have chosen to do. I'm in a perpetual state of confusion and questioning everything. But essentially what I'm looking at is the pathologization of self-directed neurodivergent play. So this idea that play does not come naturally to neurodivergent children, which is nonsense. Play comes naturally to all children, and it's about how we expand our understanding of play patterns and play cultures. My background and my work has been with babies, toddlers, and preschoolers. I think that there's so much that can be gained in development in that phase. And I think, as I said earlier on, it's often overlooked, but what we're beginning to see is that actually when we think outside of the box in terms of developmental milestones and ableist frameworks, we really can gain insights into childhoods that are really going to be transformative for our practice. So if you switch the slide, please. So what I want you to do across this session, as I'm speaking, I know it's only 8 minutes, but I want you to think of a favourite quote or song lyric that you often find that you randomly quote. And I want you to hold on to that favourite quote or song lyric. And I want you to just think as we go across the next 8 minutes, do you ever find that you randomly say the quote or song lyric? Have you ever thought the fact that you might sporadically or randomly use this quote or song lyric as a deficit or a problem or a fault within your language? Have you ever tried to correct your use of random song lyrics or quotes? And why do you think you actually do it? What makes that kind of sporadic or random event happen where you might suddenly break into song or say a quote from a favourite film or TV show? And I just want you to reflect on that as we go across this very short session. And if you do the slide, please. So, why are we here? I'm here today to speak to you about echolalia, delayed echolalia, and how it is connected to a broader form of language acquisition. As you can see from the quote there, it has a long, confusing, and quite controversial history. And it's been an area that has really given me insights and really challenged a lot of my own historical practices. I think it's important to say at this point, I am not a speech and language therapist. I'm an early childhood educator, and there will be many sources of which I will share across the session that you can go and find more technical details about what I am going to share today. But what I am hoping to offer today is a bridge between some of the progress that we are seeing in speech, language, and communication therapies and why we need to see that translated into early childhood practice, where a lot of children are spending up to 10 hours a day with key people and with early years educators, and where we are seeing the frequent communication mode of echolalia, particular immediate and delayed echolalia. And the reason I think that this is vitally important is because I reflect back on my own practice for many years working with many children where I was advised and where I was told to ignore echolalia, which is the repetition of phrases and sounds and words. So for many years, I was working with lots of children, and I would notice that they might repeat things that I am saying. They might randomly use phrases or words. And there was always this perception and this idea that actually when a child is just simply repeating what you are saying, then actually it's not actually communicative. It doesn't hold any meaning. We need to be aiming for functional or analytical language, and that's the pathway that child should be on. And when I look back at it and started to interrogate it, I actually started doing this alongside a really close professional pal called David Kahn, who runs Free to Learn Childminding in Leeds. And we have had many conversations about essentially our poor practices as practitioners. We always have conversations around what didn't we get right when we've been working with children. And one of the things that we always question is where we didn't get it right with neurodivergent and disabled children. And echolalia is one of the areas where we've had endless conversations around, oh my goodness, there are so many children that we've cared for that have used echolalia as a valid and meaningful form of communication, but we were told to ignore it. We were told to work on analytical speech strategies. And we've both over the years become more and more disillusioned by the fact that most of our early childhood documents, our frameworks, our development matters, they only describe one type of child. And that is the typically developing child, which in itself favours a particular type of development. And so we became increasingly fascinated and thinking, rather than viewing any development that falls outside of typical development, why are we defining that as a red flag or as an alarm bell or as an observation checkpoint or as a concern, a problem, something that needs to be fixed? And why are we not thinking about developmental diversity? The key question, why are we asking what is wrong and why are we not asking what is different and being more curious about those differences? And so when we were having conversations around echolalia, the repetition of phrases and words, we stumbled upon a number of American speech pathologists. There are some unbelievable accounts on social media that are really showing lots of anecdotal ways in which echolalia is actually meaningful. And what we come to understand is that echolalia is actually part of an acquisition pathway called Gestalt language processing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this short session. There is a QR code in the top of this presentation if you want to read an article that myself and David have recently put together looking at that bridge between speech and language therapy and early childhood settings. If you move on to the next slide. So what we tend to be taught when we are working in early childhood settings is we have our children come into the setting and we are generally taught that there is a typical pathway for language acquisition known as analytical language development. So if you think about it, if you think of your average early years child, they come in, they may engage in babble, they may start to become more sophisticated with their attempt at words. So we might hear some single words, then two words, and then that becomes phrases. And then that becomes more complex into sentences. Then they are engaging in social communication. So you almost view it as the building blocks of language. And so over time, the child develops their functional speech. Now, what has become understood is that we've always been trained that there is one pathway or one way of language acquisition. But what we now know is there is actually another one. And if you skip the slides, I can see Abby, so I know I'm running out of time. So what we now know is that there is another language acquisition pathway. And obviously in this short session, we can't unpick this in any great detail, but essentially there is a Gestalt language processing, which has been developed over the last 40 years. So this is a language acquisition pathway that has actually been about for 40 years, but it's never really been taken up from a research point of view. So although we have research and we have evidence and we have anecdotal examples of this happening, it's something that we need to make more salient within our child development knowledge. And what we know about Gestalt language processing is that rather than building up language in single words, or in building blocks, it's almost the reverse. So what the child develops is whole to single. So they essentially develop language in the reverse way. They still get to the same point in their language eventually, but it just works in a different way. And one of the key indicators of a Gestalt language processor is the use of echolalia, particularly delayed echolalia, which essentially means using a phrase or word over time. And it could be a few minutes later, it could be a few hours, a few days, a few months, a few years. So it is using phrases that hold specific meaning. And then what happens is rather than building that language up, we mitigate and break that language down. Where that becomes important to you as early educators is that the advice that we are potentially receiving when we are in an early childhood setting is incompatible with Gestalt language processors, because we're not necessarily seeing an acknowledgement of this different way of acquiring language. And so the reason I'm here today as an early years educator is to really raise awareness around actually what can we do as educators to really validate, to affirm, and to embrace the fact that language and communication identities don't all need to look the same way in order to be valued. And hopefully I'll get to pick up some of that within the questions. If we just skip to the last slide, and then I will finish. And again, And anyone who's seen me do anything before knows I over content everything, but you get the slides at the end. And again, please. And again, just this one. Yeah. And so just to say, the broader implication of embracing Gestalt language processing and actually finding out more about this is what it is going to help us to do is it's going to help us to push against this persistent idea that every child is traveling down the same developmental pathway. There is not one way of developing. Children are unique, and we need to stop describing and defining all children that fall outside of typically developing pathways as a problem to be fixed, as a red flag or an alarm bell. So it really gives us the opportunity to depathologize our children who are traditionally identified as special educational needs. Thank you. And sorry for running over.
Thanks so much, Kerry. We'll pick up some of what you've said in the panel discussion afterwards. I'd like to introduce Ian now, who's our next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby, and thanks so much for inviting me to take part. I'm really honoured to speak alongside Kerry and Warder, whose work I've admired for such a long time and just loved listening to their stories right now. So I'm a white man who grew up in a working class home in Northern England and whose research agenda as an academic linguist now is really just shaped by my own experiences of working first as a teacher in state schools and witnessing how marginalised children routinely experience the hostile policing of their language. So if you could just go to the next slide, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction to my work and how it speaks to our discussions this evening. So my work focuses primarily on schools and mainstream narratives about language in education policy and practice. And that work's based on years of fieldwork, close collaborations with teachers, scrutiny of thousands of Ofsted inspection reports, archival work and workshops with young children. And out of that work has emerged 4 core themes to my work. So first of all, my research uncovers what are long histories of colonial ideologies about language, which co-construct discourses of linguistic and biological deficiency, and how those ideologies continue to find their way into schools. My work, for example, has shown how during British colonialism from the 1500s, British colonisers would regularly perceive the speech of Indigenous and Black African communities as animal-like, as limited, as inferior and deficient. And those long-standing ideologies continue today in ways which continue to frame marginalised children as requiring some kind of linguistic remediation, and are often found within and produced within academic scholarship itself. So my work particularly looks at how research within applied linguistics and education can so often reproduce deficit perspectives about racialised and working class children. Thirdly, my work critiques theories of social justice, especially those which pose that equality and upward mobility can be achieved by marginalised children simply making small, modest tweaks to their language. As myself and other critical linguists have exposed, this is a flawed theory of justice because it assumes that structural determinants of oppression along the lines of race and class and disability can be overcome by making modest tweaks to an individual's language. And finally, my work critiques education policy, especially Ofsted, and how policymakers from both the political left and the political right rely on flawed theories of language and flawed theories of social justice. And on to the next slide, please. So these directions then have enabled me and my collaborators to challenge concepts and categories in language and education, which are so often taken to be universal, common sense, and taken for granted, such as with my colleague Professor Julia Snell at the University of Leeds, so-called standard English and academic language. My work with Warder and Vishnu Nair at Reading has critiqued standardised language tests. My work has critiqued so-called knowledge-rich curricula, the so-called word gap, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. and other related linguistic concepts which, at their very core, so often lie ideologies of anti-blackness and broader discourses of deficit, such as tiered vocabulary and indeed the Oracy agenda, which I'm going to present in forthcoming work coming out next year. And on to the next slide, please, which is the final one. So as we move forward with our discussions this evening, then, I just want to encourage us all to reflect on the following questions and the kinds of difficult positions that these put educational practitioners into. I'm certainly not the first to ask these kinds of questions. Warder earlier mentioned Bernard Coard, for example, back in the 1960s and 1970s, whose work against anti-Black linguistic racism and broader discourses of deficit is work that we can continue to all take inspiration from. But I want to ask questions like this. So who gets to decide what counts as evidence within language and education, and whose evidence gets framed as being objective or scientifically robust or overtly politicized, and whose theories of language and social justice get counted as more legitimate or indeed more illegitimate than others, whose lived experiences of language gets counted more than others, and whose lived experience gets platformed or sidelined or policed or silenced. And what are the histories of language and education in terms of where those ideologies about language come from, and how do they have the potential to cause harm? Finally, I want to be very, very clear that I pose these questions not in some kind of attempt to deny marginalised children appropriate language support. Far from it. I absolutely recognise that some children, of course, require additional support with their language. And I recognise that there is already brilliant practice taking place around the world, which is both sustaining and building on what children can already naturally do with their language. Indeed, as we've already heard from Warder and Kerry and their brilliant work. But they are questions which are rooted in a critical orientation to both language and justice, which ask us all to question mainstream narratives about marginalised children. So with that, I look forward to the discussion and picking up and exploring some of these ideas further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to Warder and Kerry as well. I invite you all to put your cameras back on so that we can start the panel discussion now. I really, I was listening intently to what you were all saying, and there's so many interesting pieces of information that I think we'll try and unpick with the time that we've got. And as well, please feel free, audience, to type questions in the chat for the speakers, and we'll be able to come to them during the question and answer segment as well. And some of them might be covered in the discussion that we have now. I just wanted to kind of start the discussion by acknowledging that speakers have touched on concepts like education being hostile, sometimes harmful, thinking about concepts around kind of disorder and what is normal. And Warder and Ian, you both mentioned the study by Bernard Coard. I was just wondering if you could just say a little bit about this study for attendees who might not be familiar with it. I suppose as an example of policy and practice that kind of explains, I suppose, why some of these words might have been chosen. Who would like to start?
I can start off, and then maybe Ian, you can come in. I think what the work of Bernard Coard shows is, it was in the 60s and the 70s with Afro-Caribbean children being either born here or coming over to the UK. And it details the experiences that they have had in the education system, but in particular when it came to their cognitive or language abilities. So when these children were being tested on these standardized tests, and they had come from Jamaica or anywhere else, and they had a different word for one of the words that they were being tested on, they would be marked down as failing that test and not doing well in it. And the consequences of this kind of testing resulted in many children being put into special needs school. And so this is something that we know has happened, and we know that this is also happening now because a lot hasn't changed, but we're now starting to excavate that a lot more. But it has had serious consequences on people's lives. You know, I've had discussions with people that are in their 50s now who speak about the experiences they had at school, who speak about the ways in which their language was either pathologized or problematized, when in fact they had a creative language ability, and ability to speak in many codes that maybe the teachers or the people around them didn't understand. And I think the key message of that is what we're saying now is children have complex identities, with all kinds of context that needs to be applied. And when you solely hone in and focus on the languaging of, say, for example, an Afro-Caribbean child, and you label it with many deficits, you are saying something about their identity and their sense of self. And I think the reason why we speak so much about social justice and social inequality and anti-Blackness is there's a generation that have already experienced it and faced the consequences of that. And I myself, as someone who's in their 30s, I vividly remember my own educational experiences in which I was a multilingual child who spoke many languages, but also, you know, spoke multicultural London English or Black British English, whatever you want to call it. I had a variation and my own code, and that was not valued in the education system. That was not valued when it came to me being at university. And I've made a real conscious effort for young people, young children, families to have that knowledge and know that, you know, this work of Bernard exists and all these other pieces of work exist. And in some ways, it's affirming for people, for them to know, actually, there was nothing ever wrong with my languaging. It was the system that I was in. And, you know, yeah. So pretty much that. I don't know if Ian has anything particular to add to that.
Thanks, Warda. Yeah, just very quickly, I guess. I mean, I guess like just picking up on some of the things that Warda said and just echoing the fact that I think we can all take inspiration from like the fact that there has been this critical activist work around language and education that's been taking place for so long, but that's because that work has so long been needed. Right, so it's now over 50 years since Bernard Coard's expose of what were at the time called schools for the educationally subnormal, right? And how those racist sorting mechanisms of particularly Black African and Black Caribbean children into those schools was based so much on anti-Black and deficit perceptions about what they purportedly couldn't do with their language. So Black children at the time were just repeatedly told that what they were doing with their language was inadequate. And those were some of the primary reasons why they were sorted into these schools and faced these broader processes of stigmatization. So a couple of years ago, to kind of honor like the 50th anniversary of the publication of Coard's book, my colleague at Manchester, Remy Joseph Salisbury, and Darren Wallace published an article called How Still is the Black Caribbean Child Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System? And that's a really good piece of work to read, to just like know that history, right? To locate sort of current critical work against that backdrop of a long history of critical work, which Coard's work was so integral to and continues to inspire us all.
Thank you. I can see some comments in the chat with this resonating with people who are listening, and comments of people saying that they can kind of see this being replicated in terms of multilingual, bilingual speakers and how their language is seen kind of to this current day. Thank you for shedding some light on that study for those who might be less familiar with it. It's a very painful part of history, but important to acknowledge. I'm just wondering, Kerry, if there was anything you wanted to come in on.
Yeah, I think where my reflections lie with this around the educational subnormal and thinking about the legacy of that. I think a lot of the interrogation of my own practice, particularly working on a PGCE programme, is how do we push back when we are in situations and scenarios where those ideas are still upheld, particularly around language. And I'm thinking from a kind of anecdotal experience from an inspector that asked how we would correct language. And actually, rather than being compliant to that and then being complicit, I suppose a lot of the interrogation that we've had at the university that I'm working at is how do we push back on that and really look at the different communication identities, because I think if we also consider the intersection between ableism and racism, and this is why I reject the term special educational needs, I do believe SEN has become a replacement term for actually still sustaining very much a surveillance system on how children speak. I find it very weird that we're having a lot of conversations nowadays about the importance of children having opportunities to develop rich linguistic identities, but we spend a lot of our time telling them to be quiet or to change how they're speaking. So I think there's I've been reading a lot lately about the facade of inclusion, that there's so many contradictions in actually the systems of inclusion, and we've got to think about which groups of children are being most marginalised. And I often find that it's those that have those multiple experiences of being labelled special educational needs and then seeing that anti-Blackness and racism, which I think is quite overt. I think we need to stop viewing it as covert or unconscious. I think it's quite overt what we're seeing. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thanks, Kerry. And I guess that links to the Bernard Corden, the educationally subnormal schools, which was actually educational policy. So that was definitely overt. I think that leads us quite nicely on to just thinking about, actually, you said, you mentioned kind of a language-rich approach, and thinking about this concept of the word gap. I think some of the audience would be really interested to hear, particularly because of how it's used in terms of early years and helping children to develop their speech, language, and communication skills. So I'll open that up to you to have some thoughts on. Ian, shall I start with you?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to speak about that first. I'm sure that Kerry and Warder will perhaps have things to say about the word gap as well, because it's so pertinent, right? I mean, I can talk about the word gap in relation to my own work and how it's become normalized in schools, particularly primary schools and secondary schools. So I acknowledge that that's slightly different from early years, but nonetheless, the logics are the same. So I'll try and kind of tailor what I'm going to say towards early years. So I guess, first of all, I would want us to think very critically about what that concept of the word gap is, including where it emerged from within its original academic research, and how that concept has been taken up in a way which is now used to kind of buttress what I argue is a flawed theory of social justice. So my work has focused primarily on how the word gap has been normalized within schools and education policy, but in a way that I've seen and I would argue has been particularly harmful for marginalized children, because it relies on anti-Black and deficit framings about what they purportedly can't do with their language. So my fieldwork in schools, for example, has repeatedly shown how racialized and working class kids get labeled by schools and by policy as having some kind of word gap, and that it's their language that is the problem, whereas really the problem is the actual measurement tools that are used to assess them. So the word gap is a concept which is based on a flawed theory of language. That's so important to take away from this. And it's a concept about language that's rooted in specifically anti-Black and classist methodologies. So the word gap emerged from a US study in the mid-90s, which made this claim that high-income white families talk A, more frequently, and B, with a wider variety of vocabulary than low-income Black families, and that this was the primary reason why they were struggling in school. So Betty Hart and Todd Risley, the original academics who produced this work, conducted observations of families over a couple of years and simply calculated that the average hourly rate of words spoken to children from their caregivers was about 600 per hour from the lowest income group and about 1,200 per hour or something from the kind of highest economic group. and then extrapolated those numbers to produce this idea that by the time of the age of 4, kids in the high income group have heard 30 million fewer words. So the number itself is like a modeled number. The number itself isn't really a real number. So first of all, like, that's a flawed theory of language, right? Because it's rooted in very narrow and reductive understandings about what constitutes language. It equates vocabulary size with language, but as we know, language is much more than that. Secondly, the study is specifically rooted in anti-Black linguistic racism, because the 13 families in the highest income group, just one of those was Black, whereas the 6 families in the lowest income group, all 6 were Black, all 6 were African American. So the amazing US scholar April Baker Bell would absolutely call this an example of anti-Black linguistic racism, where these deficit assumptions about working class and Black children are used as a frame to then categorize them as linguistically deficient. So other brilliant people like Warder and Arlette Willis, again in the US, and even as far back as the people like William Labov in the 1970s, have repeatedly shown that working class Black communities are perfectly capable of producing the kind of complex language and so-called rich vocabularies that the original architects of the word gap were claiming they couldn't do. So in UK education policy over the last few years, then the word gap has kind of been taken up as a tool and presented to teachers as being this like robust, scientific, empirically objective piece of research, which is used as a vehicle to produce this narrative of social justice. That's a really dangerous narrative to me. At the same time, it's a complete misrepresentation of what the actual research represents. Yet those framings and those anti-Black methodologies about the word gap are kind of conveniently overlooked in mainstream UK policy. So it's a flawed theory of justice because it makes this assumption that small, modest-based tweaks to somebody's language, specifically their vocabulary, is this kind of panacea, this kind of single solution to fixing broader inequalities. And I've got no doubt that language is central to justice, but to pin vocabulary as the single solution to addressing those factors, especially when that concept is rooted in anti-Black methodologies, is something that's deeply problematic, and we should all be very, very skeptical of as a concept when it appears in policy and indeed within practice.
Thank you. And Wada, Kerry, would either of you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, this just kind of made me think about, I really do believe that language is our most powerful tool for creation. And so I really often think, what does it do to the groups of children and individuals that are labeled as having problems with language? Is what they create with their language any less powerful, beautiful, or essential? And is the language of Black children, like, is the language that Black children produce less capable of as a tool for creation than what white children speak? And it's just, I just really want us to think that, you know, is what Black children create, like, is what they attempt to create with their language flawed? Is their contribution to the world then deficient? Is their vocabulary so small that it limits the possibility of what they can bring into fruition? And I know that sounds really like big and deep, but it's this idea of when you minimize a people's humanity, their dignity, their identity, their language, and you distill it down to these issues of deficiency and having, you know, limited, you know, when you say someone's language is limited, what are you saying about them? I think it's really important to know that there are people in our society that are given these labels more than other people. And that's often those that are most marginalized, and that's often Black children. And this is why we often we specifically talk about anti-Black linguistic discrimination or anti-Black racism, because despite, you know, I think having interventions and programs and all of that, yes, essential to support some children, yeah, a certain group of children. But what about the Black children that have been excluded from, that have never been considered? Their languaging has never been considered, you know? the beauty and the creativity and the multimodality of all of this languaging and the complex identities are minimized, and what's looked at is from this lens, from this Eurocentric frame, from a standardized test. They're measured on that. And so what I'm just really saying is think bigger than that. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. I think that makes absolute sense. And I'm speaking as well as someone, as an educational psychologist who has been trained to use standardized tests with children as well. And really interesting sometimes the difference and what you see in terms of the tests and then the conversation you have with the children and what they're able to convey and communicate outside of that standardized testing situation. It's very interesting to observe, but important, as you're both saying, to hold in mind, thinking about the support that the child needs in a way that comes from a strength perspective, I think. Kerry, did you want to come in and add anything?
Yeah, so I think thinking about it purely through my own experiences in an early years lens, I think, when I started working as a practitioner 18 years ago, I would say 18 years later, I still go into early childhood settings and the word gap is a thing. And so it feels like it has become a literal training in bias. You still see early educators. And I think that this is where we do need to query sometimes this fascination with evidence-based, because I think people often take it as, well, that is the authority on knowledge and that's what we must follow. And we need people to be more research curious rather than saying, well, we'll just, take on research and apply it. So I think it's been enduring. I think the other thing that we've got to recognize is that it has had implications on other aspects of our frameworks. And I still find today the fact that we have a framework that defines a good level of development at age 5 based on how much you speak, which obviously then links to the vocabulary, in itself becomes another bias tool, and it becomes exclusionary to many different communication identities. And what we know in early childhood is we do have non-speakers, we have minimal speakers, we have Gestalt language processors, we have linguistic variety. And I think sometimes the fascination with intervening and interacting at all times, we're taking the fun out of language. And anybody who's hung around with young children, they are so creative in how they language. They're so creative in the risks that they will take. And so I think, if I'm honest, I think what we're seeing a lot in early childhood practice is we're seeing this standardization and this top-down heaviness kind of infiltrate the early years, and it's taken the joy out of language. And I think because language is so intrinsically linked to other aspects of our identity, I think we've got to acknowledge that very early on in a child's life, we are positioning them in society for when they then go into school and then are, kind of subjected to some of these compliant-based systems that do target particular groups of children and particular identities. So I think it's about also recognizing that when something else that I've rejected, and I know it's controversial, is I reject the use of early intervention in early childhood. We are attuning to children and we are certainly interacting in appropriate ways. But I think this top-heavy, intervene, speak to children at all times, take them off so that they can list flashcards or name things that are in a box so we can build the vocabulary. We're creating a fragmented system of communication and language development. And I think we need to bring it back together and really center joy, because language is very fun. Hence why children love to copy swear words, because they love the intonation and they love trialing out different language. So I think we need to expand our parameters of what we see as successful communication and not define a good level of development on how much you speak. It should be much broader than that.
Really interesting ideas there, and it just made me think about like when you have your individual education plan or your SEN support plan, and what you said about intervention and those targets that educators on this call, I guess, will be really familiar with trying to make sure that they're measuring progress against, and the approach that you kind of described around joy and around centering the child's language, and the point around children being creative around language, I think it made me smile just thinking about various examples. We just staying for a moment with children who might acquire language differently, I think I'd just be really interested to hear from some of your kind of practical examples where you've been able to, the examples that you can bring to life for people on this call to think about a way that you might have supported a particular child or particular educator to think differently about a child and to support them with their language development, but centering joy, centering the child's kind of cultural identity and their background.
I can speak to that. I think the answer is a very complicated one because, as I said, I do not purport to hold any answers. I purport to trying things, experimenting, hypothesis testing, and really try to maintain to be a affirming practitioner in whatever it is that I'm doing. I think the shift for me in my practice was when I, in no uncertain terms, throughout the rule book of what I, as a speech and language therapist, what I should be doing versus what I am doing. And so I've had the opportunity to be in spaces in which they've allowed me to explore. And so I think that's where this idea of spaces of reprieve came, alongside with Vishnu Nair at Reading University, in which, for a really long time I was thinking, well, I know that there's all these hostile language policies. I know that there's all these expectations on the children that I work with, that they're pathologized or their language is deemed as less or needs remediation. And I don't have what power do I have? What can I do for them? And so the spaces of reprieve is just an idea that it could be for a moment in time, whether it was half an hour a week. I had these group of children who their teachers and stuff like that were saying, they've got real difficulties with attention, with processing. We don't, their expressive language or their ability to understand is marked or reduced. And what I did was I kind of thought, well, I'm not going to treat them as children who have difficulties with their language. I'm going to treat them as bi-directional communicators with me. And I kind of got to know when I saw that some of these children have their own code, because I can tell you that there have been times and sessions where I've been with children and I have not been able to understand what they're talking about or how they're expressing things. But the other children in the group would answer their questions and they were in tune with each other. And that was a really big shift for me, because I came in as an outsider and I said, oh, I don't understand some of these children and their codes of communication, but these other children understand each other. So what is it that they're doing that I'm not doing? And I shifted to that. I know often we talk about that active listening, but I would say I shifted into a more active, conscious listening to really connect with those children and provide a space, one that was safe, one that was non-judgmental, one that the labels that they had previously been provided, I'm not saying those labels don't matter and I didn't take them into account, but I treated them as if those things didn't exist. And what emerged was, as I would say to you, a creative communication style, a give and take in communication, where I developed the ability to be able to communicate with them in their way, but then they also began to develop to communicate with me in my way. And so it's an abstract concept and people won't understand unless they really do it, right? But what happened in these spaces of reprieve is children's confidence, their self-esteem, their sense of self, how they started to think about themselves as communicators, it shifted in their mind. So before, where they would say to me, oh, I'm stupid. I've heard that many a time where a child says to me, they're stupid, they're no good. I've heard that. And it shifted to, oh, I'm a competent communicator because Warder understands me. My friends understand me. I feel good when I talk to them. So, it's a relationship. It's a rapport. You're not ever going to see the best of what someone has unless they feel comfortable to show you that. And the second part of spaces of reprieve was what I realized was actually These children need a moment and a space where they're away from all of that hostility and they could be themselves, which is children. And, those children have done very, very well. And this work that I've done has been, replicated and repeated in schools in London, hence why people want my services, or people may be looking for an alternative approach. But this happens with testing, with trying, with having faith in yourself, with having communication with sometimes people outside of speech and language therapy who are already doing either innovative things or have thought about these questions. So I found people in early years education, sociolinguistics, people like Ian, Kerry, Vishnu, and had these real deep, in-depth discussions. So what I would say to you is, it's the reason why we keep harking on about anti-Blackness, about linguistic discrimination, about racism, about interrogating these things, is because they really do exist, and we're working while they exist. So what could, in the limited time that we have, what can we do for these children? And just one last aspect of that is, when I taught children as young as 5 what standardized language ideologies were, what some of this work that I'm doing was, they understood it, right? These young children understood and were able to comprehend and say, hey, I live in a world, in a system in which my language, in which my skin, in which my identity is prejudged in some way. However, I have the power to know that my language is beautiful, I am a competent communicator, and I can turn up in spaces and speak how I want to speak. And in order to have those experiences with those children, I too had to be vulnerable. So I changed how I speak, because I would often code switch whenever I was in a formal meeting or with other people and try to speak the right way, which was what I've been taught my whole life. But those experiences with those children allowed me to say, you know what, I'm going to speak like I'm from South London. I'm going to talk how I want to talk, and I'm going to show these children that I can do it and they can do it. And so, that's a long way to say it, but yeah.
Thanks, Wada. And I wanted to just pick up on a couple of your points, actually, and thinking about colleagues here that work in the early years sector, because I think so much of what you've said has real relevance to early years practice in terms of the way that practitioners, engage in child-led interactions and meet the children where they are. And it just made me think a little bit about intensive interaction and children who are pre-verbal. And there's a comment in the chat about children who express themselves in different ways, like other forms of communication, thinking about things like art and dancing, music, which are all kind of, just wondering about whether that kind of features in some of the work you do. So I'll hand over to Ian and Kerry to just expand on that a bit more.
You go first, Kerry. Okay. I've forgotten what the question was, but it was examples. I think drawing on what Ward has spoken about, actually, around focusing and thinking about your own communication identity and how vulnerable we perhaps are with how we ourselves communicate, and also thinking about the different forms of knowledge that children bring to our early years settings and how it's interconnected to so many aspects of their lives. I suppose that's kind of the reflection in my head. And then from a practical point of view, as I said, a lot of my early childhood practice when I first started out was quite poor. I just didn't have the knowledge and the pedagogy to understand child development. And so I was kind of quite superficial in a lot of my interactions with children. And what I realised over time is that I would never, with another adult, meet up with them and throw a load of direct questions at them about what colour, how many, how much. And what I noticed is that there is often a pressure in early childhood for us always to be seen, to be interacting. We always need to be switched on. It's commented upon in inspections if you are not interacting enough. I remember once having an Ofsted inspector kind of mark me down in terms of my own interactions because I didn't speak enough, even though I knew intuitively with that child that there was a whole body of communication happening beyond spoken language. And so what I've kind of focused on in the years that I've worked with young children is actually, how do we have authentic interactions with children that are not just about throwing loads of questions at them, particularly with children with developmental differences who can lean into demand avoidance, who can be very quickly overwhelmed when you've got an adult wanting to talk at you all the time. And I also needed to address that power balance of I'm the effective communicator, I'm the knowledgeable other, and what I say is, you know, kind of the authority, and actually getting down to children's level, meeting them in their play, engaging in a lot of parallel and mirroring play with them. So really recognizing I'm entering your linguistic world rather than expecting you to enter mine. And a real game changer for me, and a lot of this is written by the work of Lisa Murphy, I think her name is. But she has written a guide called the Declarative Language Manual, and it's about how we engage in more authentic interactions with children so that we build communication connections with them. And what I've found is that when you're taking the pressure off children to speak or be a certain way, you start to have more authentic experiences with them where language naturally kind of happens. It's kind of self-generated from a more natural environment. And so actually when I'm out in early childhood settings, I'm not wanting to hear lots of language. Sometimes silence is golden, or sometimes looking at the non-verbal communication, looking at the mirroring, thinking of, again, of some of the intensive interactions that we see. So I think from a practice-based point of view, it is about meeting children where they're at. The other really key strategy is about affirming and validating all communication attempts and not pathologizing children's language and communication, which I think we still see happen a lot in early childhood settings. So it's about really responding and acknowledging those attempts, not correcting children's language, not criticizing how they communicate. And I think another thing is not expecting them to be quiet. You know, I love children who shout out and don't put their hands up. I love children who use their big bodies to communicate and they don't just rely on spoken language. So I think it is about, I would say authentic interactions are the best ones. And moving on from this, I don't know if it resonates with the people who are here, but you do sometimes see like adult-child interactions as very like, hello, how many is that? And it's so superficial that it's like, that's not how you would speak with another human. So why are we doing it with child humans? We need to be looking for that connection and being aware of linguistic differences as well. So I know Warder spoke about the code switching. I think we definitely need to see more research into the double empathy problem and code switching. I think at the moment, double empathy seems to have overlooked racialized identities within the double empathy problem. And I think we do need to what has already happened in linguistic diversity and a neurodiversity point of view. I don't know if that makes sense. It did in my brain.
That's really interesting, Kerry, and I'd just like to signpost people to the guide that you wrote for Early Years in Mind, where it gives a bit more of a description about the double empathy problem. I think it's really helpful to think about that. And I really like the way you described meeting children where they're at and thinking about, you know, how sometimes we're kind of primed to overload children. It just made me think about that kind of empty vessel theory where children are expected to be filled by us with knowledge. Ian, did you want to come in and add anything?
I can speak very quickly. Like we just heard amazing work by Warder and Kerry. So my own work, I guess, in like trying to challenge these things in very practical ways has been in kind of late primary and early secondary school. So I'll just pick up on some of the things that Kerry and Warder were saying about, especially about like bringing in joy into school spaces and like trying to legitimize what kids are already doing with their language, but also like pushing the boundaries about what typically constitutes like adequate or normalized communication and what constitutes like language and languaging practices in schools. So a couple of years ago, I worked on a project with an amazing school teacher, and I can post the link in the chat maybe later. But our focus was on how marginalized children could put a name and try to make sense of their own lived experiences of language discrimination in schools. So we were working with 10 to 11-year-olds on this project, and we simply gave them time and space to read various pieces of fiction. And that included like full novels through to poems, through to wordless picture books, etc. But the thing that tied all of those pieces of fiction together was that they all included descriptions of language discrimination themselves in various ways. So we then used those texts as just a springboard in like workshop spaces to try and get kids just to talk about how what they were reading about in those fictionalized accounts of language discrimination like helped to put into words how some things that they'd long been experiencing. So what we found was that these kids suddenly had this space like away from formal timetables and away from some of the more like formal regimes of policing and normative expectations that Kerry was just talking about. They had this space to just interrogate and critically explore their own lived experience of language stigma and policing. And we're just given this license to absolutely draw on multiple ways of using language, which transcended borders across named languages, across different varieties of languages. So they weren't just speaking about it, but they were using art and movement and freeze frames and so on to represent their own relationship with language and to try and make sense what was happening to them in terms of their language. And then finally, we worked with this incredible artist, Wendy Wong, who herself has lived experience of language discrimination. And Wendy produced this series of images that represented some of the things that the kids were talking about. So we had these really powerful set of images that we were then able to take into schools to kind of use as kind of training materials, etc., with teachers and teacher educators. So I'll post the link to the article, but also to Wendy's work and the images which came out of that project as well.
Thanks, Ian. I think it's such a nice idea to have a kind of material there for the children to use to reflect on their own experiences. Probably very powerful for them to have words that someone else has written that describes their experience. I think that we've got quite a lot of questions in the chat, and we've just got just over 15 minutes left of the webinar. So I'll have a look at some of the questions and pose some of those to you. We've touched on a bit about non-verbal or pre-verbal communication and communicating in different ways. So maybe to just go back to that point, Kerry, you said like children moving with using their big bodies to move, but yeah, I guess to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking about the different ways children communicate. And I think whether that's something you might want to expand on, or you might have already. I'm just checking.
I think I have already, but I know we haven't touched on children that are non-verbal, etc., which is often a bias that we have, because I mean I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've recently written something with a scholar over in America called Octavian Robinson, and I think it's called Uncloaking Oralism. And it's just this idea that we just seem to think that the best way, the apex of communication is to be able to communicate verbally, but many people exist in this world and don't communicate verbally but have many other systems, and these are equally valid. And I think sometimes there is this push when a child is non-verbal or pre-verbal or not speaking, that, you know, parents or as practitioners, we're kind of pushing for oral speech. And I just think for my own self, it's something for me to be mindful of in this world, and to know that there are many ways to exist, and there are many modalities in which communication is valid. And I just think it is just about us shifting our mind frame to think about that and consider that a lot more. And clearly we don't.
And this is very pertinent with having Rob and Paul, I think, on this call as our BSL interpreters. Kerry, did you want to come in and expand?
Yeah, I think just to say that we need to remember that children need to move in order to be able to think, and then that thinking becomes part of their communication. In a book that I read, I'm really bad with names, I'm so sorry, but there is a book called A Moving Child is a Learning Child. And I remember reading it and looking at all the sensory systems and how we sensory integrate, the differences that can occur with that, the importance or the impact of too much sedentary behaviour on young children, and this idea that we're just trying to kind of contain unruly bodies. But actually children use their body as a real predominant form of communication. They let you know how they feel, they express needs. I think the body is also a really important self-advocacy tool. You can be around a child and know by their body language whether they are providing permission, whether they are not given permission, if they want something. And I think we really need to spend time really tuning in to how children, particularly non-speaking and non-verbal children, are using their bodies. And just a point on that as well, I think we often hear people use the term non-verbal, which may in some cases be the case. But what we tend to use more commonly in early childhood now is we will say non-speaking, because what we are observing in practice is that even if a child is not using analytical or functional language, there are so many vocalizations. There is babble, there is vocal stimming, and children will vocalize a lot, and it is often connected to their movement. What we know with a lot of neurodivergent children, particularly autistic and other emergent neurotypes, is that there is an affinity for movement, because children will be sensory craving, sensory seeking, also sensory avoiding. And I think we need to stop telling our children to be still or to have quiet hands and to have looking eyes and listening ears. I was with a group of students the other day and I was like, imagine as an adult that I said to you, you have to think about exactly what I'm saying. I know your minds are all wandering in other places. I know you're going to fidget in order to regulate. And I think sometimes we're just trying to contain children's bodies for later compliance in the school system, but actually they need to be exercising those muscles, and they all contribute to that broader communication scope that they have. So yeah, I just think we need to stop telling children to be still, because it's such a boring way of being. I think we need to embrace being movement driven and moving in lots of weird and wonderful ways. I think that again is the joy of early childhood, that it is wonderfully chaotic.
Thanks, Kerry. And it just made me reflect actually on whether, you know, if this session was taking place in person, how I guess I am socialized to think, are people looking at me? Does that mean they're listening? So yeah, I guess it is quite ingrained in our ways of thinking that if someone's looking at you and facing you and they're still, that means that they're paying attention to you. But we know that that might not be the case.
Yeah, and just to jump in there as well, I think often the things that we see as a sign of attention is actually a sign of disengagement. So I will often say to people, as an autistic person, if I'm giving you eye contact, it's less likely that I'm listening to anything you're saying, because I'm so focused on giving you creepy eye contact that I'm not able to auditory process what's being said. So actually fleeting eye contact is usually more of a sign that I'm engaging. And we see that with young children as well. They'll be using their minds and bodies to engage. And I know I'm kind of maybe harping on about it a little bit, but this whole body listening agenda that we still see in early childhood and still seeing in interventions. I saw a very popular intervention program recently that gave children good listening stickers. I don't want children to be wearing good listening stickers because they have complied to this body conformity, which actually feels very, very uncomfortable for them and is directly harming those children whose nervous systems do not develop through sedentary sitting still behaviors.
I think that's a really important point about body autonomy, and it kind of links to the safeguarding things that we teach children in terms of being able to have autonomy of their movement and what feels comfortable or not comfortable for them. So a really important point there. Ian, did you want to come in and add any?
Just very quickly, like I don't have much to add, but like here what I will say is that like the policing of spoken language so often, as Kerry has just pointed to, co-articulates with the policing of the body and children's entire way of moving. So in primary and secondary school education at the moment, people like Doug Lemov, right, and his Teach Like a Champion program, which is widely used in schools, includes like a whole host of strategies which absolutely require children to do things like Kerry was just pointing to, that are so ableist and problematic. So to sit still, sit up, put their hands on the table, maintain eye contact, have their feet on the floor, speak in full sentences, and so on. That kind of pedagogy is so deeply problematic and so deeply ableist. Yeah, and this gets back to some of the things that we've kind of touched upon throughout this panel, is that it is presented to teachers and educational practitioners as evidence, as research informed, as scientifically objective, as like rooted in evidence and like what works. And it's feverishly taken up in policy. So there's a bigger issue here that we should all like question what that notion of evidence actually represents. It's something that we should be skeptical of, that we should be very wary of, and we should seek to push back against, because it is such a powerful narrative. Especially, I think, at the moment when there is such an impetus on school leaders and educational practitioners to show that what they're doing is somehow in line with research and is somehow in line with what constitutes evidence. For me, the bigger question is, well, who gets to decide what counts as evidence? And as Kerry and Warder have just both so beautifully shown, what often is counted as evidence is often so deeply racist and so deeply ableist. So for me, that's a really important question when it comes to speaking back to some of those ideas about what constitutes normative ways of languaging, but also normative ways of actually holding your body and facial expressions and so on.
And I think some really powerful points there.
Could I just come in, Abby? Yeah. I think what Ian's saying is really important, because I think there are a lot of practitioners or people out there, whether they work in early years or not, who the ideas that we've shared today, who are engaged with those ideas on a theoretical level, but on a more practical level they're confined by whatever place, institute, system that they work in, and sometimes may feel like, well, how I agree with what you lot are saying, but how can I put this into practice explicitly when actually the research or the evidence that the school policies or whatever I've been told is based on this, and actually to do this is a bit problematic for me. I think it's really important that we all as practitioners kind of recognize that as times move on and things hopefully change, there were times in definitely in this country's history where how children were treated in schooling or education was seen as typical and good and normal. And now we hark back and look, oh my God, is this what we used to do to children 40, 50 years ago? Whether it was, children were allowed, whether it was a teacher was allowed to scold a child or physically hit them, that happened 50 years ago, 40 years ago. I have friends in their 50s and 60s who say, yeah, that's what my teacher used to do. And that was seen as normal and typical and good. And so I want us to not be jaded by the fact that we're in 2023 and we feel like policies or the things that are happening are right and good or are part of the evidence base. So breaking away from that, I would say to you, like, this stuff that we're talking about is not stuff that you can do by yourself. It's stuff that comes as part of a collective, as part of a group, as part of an understanding. So if you want to practice in these ways, you're not alone. You just have to find the people that are doing this and reach out to us, and we can support you to implement that, because I, from a first-hand experience, know how difficult it is to be a speech and language therapist who practices in their own way. I understand the pressure that can put on people, so I recognize that as a fear. So reach out to people and know that not everything that is given to you in an evidence base or comes out of the research is correct or right for you to follow. Yeah, that's really important.
Thanks, Wada. And I just reference back to something I think it was Kerry might have said earlier about being research curious. That really kind of stuck with me, and I like that idea of being supported by others as part of that, as part of doing this work, as being important too. We have about 4 more minutes left of the webinar, and I was just thinking actually a nice way of wrapping things up might be if I just go around in turn and ask you your kind of reflections of participating in this webinar, how it felt for you, and if there's anything, any kind of last words you'd like to give to the practitioners and parents, carers who might be listening around supporting children. Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in. I suppose for me, my own learning is it's a reminder that everything is connected. We can't really talk about things in isolation. So obviously today I'm focusing on echolalia and Gestalt language processing, but I'm acutely aware that that also intersects with anti-Blackness, it intersects with racism, and I think always making sure that we are salient to the fact that our children come to our early childhood settings with multiple identities and funds of knowledge. And so we really need to look at that kind of holistic picture of development. And I think a really big piece of learning for me today is always interrogating where your own bias may sit and being prepared to untangle and unpick that in order to do the best for our children and to really affirm and validate how they communicate, how they play, and how they exist in the world.
Thanks, Kerry. Well done.
I think for me, it's been a really liberating experience to be able to share a moment with both Ian and Kerry, whose work I respect massively, but also to be given a platform to discuss these really important issues freely is so important. So I think for me, it's just kind of hopefully it will be the beginning of something for Anna Freud or other people that are interested in this type of work, of bringing people together and discussing these ideas, because I think much of our work is about emancipation and liberation and freedom, not just for the children that we work with, but for ourselves as well. I know Kerry was talking about joy before, but it's also, how can we as practitioners or people that work with children experience joy in our day-to-day lives? The things that would probably enhance our working day are the things that would enhance the children's school day. And so just to think about this in the sense of this, it's not necessarily always just all about the children. It's also how good you feel in the work that you're doing. So thank you for the space.
Thank you for comments, Ian.
Yeah, thank you. To totally echo what Kerry and Wood have both said, I've just learned so much from listening. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for the brilliant and sensitive questions. I guess what I've really been reflecting on is like where we should locate our critique, like going forward. And for me, like critique should be of both theories of language, but also theories of social justice. So any theory of language which is rooted in normative and deficit and dichotomous framings to me is problematic, but also any theory of social justice which places the burden on marginalised speakers to modify what they do with their language is a flawed vision for justice, yet is a narrative that is so common and so mainstream. Secondly, I think our critique should be of the so-called evidence which underpins education policy, like we were just talking about. And instead, our focus should be on radical transformation as opposed to modest reforms and modest tweaks. And very finally, our focus should not be on what marginalised speakers do, but on what powerful listeners do, or what powerful perceivers do, or readers do. Because as like Bernard Coard taught us, right, to circle back to where we first started, the problem is actually not the speaker at all. The problem lies in how those speakers are perceived, tested, and categorized. And I know just talking about speech, but that extends to all ways of using language, where the problem lies not with the people that are producing that language, but in how the people are and how powerful people are perceiving that language. So that's what I'd like to end on. Thanks.
Thank you so much to the speakers, Kerry, Wada, Ian. Thank you to Rob and Paul, our BSL interpreters, and to Anna Freud colleagues for supporting this event, and for all of you who've taken time out of your day to listen. I can see that there are questions about finding out more about Ian's work, some of the references that Kerry mentioned as well during the webinar. And what we'll do is we'll collate some of this so we can send it to you in the post-event feedback, with the post-event feedback materials as well. So I'd just like to say thank you again for joining us this evening. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening. And it's given me so much to think about. I'm sure the same applies for all of you listening. And please do share this recording if you think other people will find it useful when it comes up on our YouTube channel.